My name's Eugene Kielt. I'm the owner of Laurel Villa Guesthouse in Magherafelt, and this has been known as a house of poetry. We have a number of Ulster poets featured: Kavanagh, Longley, McNeice, and also Seamus Heaney. I suppose first became aware of Seamus Heaney around about the late 60s. I heard him talking about fathering the cattle and garring spuds and blackberry picking and churning and all the rest, and I could identify with it because I was brought up on a farm and we only moved into the town here in Magherafelt whenever I was about 11 or so. For the first time I could identify with a poet and what he was writing about. So I always from that took an interest in him, and then we started collecting his books and first editions and his broadsides. So we have quite a nice little collection of his work here, and some of it quite unusual. We have a set of 10 Seamus Heaney poems on linen. This one is of particular interest here. It's called Tractors, and it was the first poem of his to be published outside of the university magazines. And apart from the initial publication in the Telegraph in 1962, to my knowledge, has never been published anywhere else. So if anybody wants to see the poem, they can do it. They're staying with us here. Another particular favourite of mine is Bogland. Then the next one is Thatcher. Some people who wouldn't be too familiar with Heaney asked me, is that about Maggie? Meaning Margaret Thatcher, but it's about a local craftsman. Thatcher used to go around the South Derry area here. Also about the craft, of course, of writing a poem. We're now in the Seamus Heaney suite bedroom, which contains a nice portrait of Seamus Heaney by Neil Shawcross. There's also a number of poems here. One of them is a poem called Quitting Time, which was in his most recent collection, and it's about his brother who still farms in Blackhead. Another poem here is The Forge, and there's a photograph of Seamus Heaney with the present owner of the Forge, Barney Devlin, and one or two other things on very recent broadside of Seamus Heaney's, and this is called In the Attic, and it's quite appropriate because we're actually in the attic of the guest house. And this is a poem he wrote. It's really about the aging process. But in this he mentions about going to the parochial hall in Castledawson and seeing the film Treasure Island and going across the road to where his grandfather lived, and his grandfather mentioning the name of the actor in it. But he called the actor Isaac, and it was actually Israel. And so in this Heaney says that he also is misremembering names. So now we're going to go on a short tour of Heaney country, taking you to some of the places associated with Seamus Heaney and some of his poems. Now we're at the hillhead outside Castledawson, and we're in the Forge, a well-known landmark here in the area, and I'm standing alongside Barney Devlin, who's the owner of the Forge here, and Seamus Heaney wrote not one but two poems about the Forge. The first was the poem called The Forge, which was in the second collection, and more recently he wrote one called Midnight Anvil. The poem The Forge would be one of his best known poems, and the Heaneys just lived down the road here at Mossbawn, and Seamus would have passed the Forge while going to the hillhead and into Castledawson, maybe get the bus to his relations in Blackhead. So this was a place which would have been well known to all the community. Blacksmith's Forge was where people congregated and killed and exchanged the news about what was happening. So it was very well known, as it still is today. We're here in Castledawson now, which is about 3 miles from Magherafelt. And Seamus Heaney was born just outside Castledawson on a farm called Mossbawn. But Castledawson was very important to him because it was the nearest village. And also his mother, whose name was McCann, was from Castledawson, and she was from New Row. This was a street that was just up to our right, and the sequence of sonnets called Clearances mentions New Row a few times. And down to our left is Mayola Park Football Club, one of the oldest soccer clubs in Ireland, and Seamus Heaney's grandfather, he played for Mayola Park. And Seamus wrote a poem called The Old Team about those early days of the club. And just in front of us is a factory chimney, and that was of Clark's Linen Mill, which would have been a very important employer whenever he was growing up, Seamus was growing up. And the McCanns, his grandfather and granduncles would have worked for the Clarks. We're now here in Blackhead village, and we're just beside the statue of the Turf Man. This was a statue commissioned by the local development association to commemorate Seamus Heaney's involvement with the area that he came from, and it shows the Turf Man digging turf, and this was just opened or unveiled by Seamus Heaney himself last year. So this is a good place for people to come for photographs of their visit to Heaney country. Just behind that is the building which is known as Blackhead Bawn. This dates from the 1600s, and it is today a visitor centre, and it contains a lot of information about the area, historical, archaeological information on the area. Also, it's got a Seamus Heaney library and a lot of his recordings, TV interviews, etc. So it's for anybody, a serious student of Heaney, it's definitely worth a visit. At the moment, during the winter months, it's got restricted opening, but during the summer, it'll be open most days of the week. And for anybody interested in the culture of Northern Ireland, this would be one of the places that one should go to learn more about Seamus Heaney. We're standing here at the Mayola River, on the bank of the Mayola River, not far from Castledawson. And on this side here, this is the townland of Bells Hill, and on the other side is the townland of Bruch. Seamus Heaney, whenever he was young, would have come down to the river here, and there used to be a series of stepping stones you could have crossed from one side of the river to another. So the Mayola was another marker, or a very definite boundary for him whenever he was growing up. Now we're down at Church Island and Loch Beg here, and this is just about a mile or so from Blackhead, and this must be one of the most beautiful parts of the whole of the north of Ireland, and a place that Seamus Heaney would have known very well. He would have played here as a child, and the place is also a setting for one of his best known poems called The Strand at Loch Beg, which was an elegy for a second cousin of his who was murdered during the Troubles. Again, this would be one of the places that people can visit. I would always bring people to this area here, not only because of the Heaney connection, but it's just a lovely, tranquil place to visit. Well, anybody can come on the tour. You don't need to be a real Heaney fan or Heaney bopper, as sometimes they're called. People of all ages, it would suit them. You can, if you want to give us a call, our number is 028 7930 1459. Or if you want to visit our website, www.laurel-villa.com.